Hello, FJC. This week, as we wrap up the book of Breshit, I want to talk about Joseph, because he's a central character and my perspective on him has changed a lot over the years. It used to be, I thought Joseph was obviously the successor to Jacob, so much so that I wondered why we didn't count him as a fourth patriarch. And in fact, there's a teaching in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, that Abraham instituted the Shacharit prayer service, Isaac instituted Mincha, and Jacob instituted Ma'ariv. And when I first learned that, it immediately occurred to me we should just add Joseph, having instituted Musaf. Their names come from the same root, and that would just be a totally logical extension of this idea that our prayer services go back that early. And then, probably right around the time I started working at Trua, I spent more time with the story at the end of last week's Parsha, where Joseph effectively enslaves all of Egypt in the course of distributing the food that he's accumulated over the course of the 7 abundant years. If you'll remember, when he's the viceroy of Egypt, and there's 7 years of exceptional harvest, he gathers all that extra food in, and then this is the part of the story that we don't usually learn or tell our children. In the first year, he sells the grain back to the Egyptians for all their money. In the second year, they come to him and say, "We have no money, here, take our livestock." In the third year, they come to him and say, "We have no more livestock, here, take all of our lands." And in the fourth year, they say, "We've got nothing else, here, take us as slaves." And so Joseph enslaves all of Egypt at the end of last week's Parsha, that is to say, Vayigash. And not only that, but he moves people from one part of the country to the other, kind of shifts them around in what you might call forced transfer, or maybe even ethnic cleansing, if you wanted to push the envelope a little bit further. And in my mind, it really sets up very much Pharaoh's enslavement of the Israelites. Sort of a turnabout is fair game kind of situation. And that really negative feeling on Joseph really reaches its zenith in a Dvar Torah that Jeff Marker and I wrote for Trua that came out 2 weeks ago. I just sort of thought he's the apotheosis of all the terrible things a leader can do in terms of taking advantage of power. And then I happened to come across in my email inbox this wonderful, wonderful essay by Rabbi Tali Adler, who's ordained at Yeshivat Maharat and now teaches at Hadar, that doesn't actually do anything to erase all the ickiness about Joseph enslaving the Egyptians, but balances it out in my mind with a different perspective on him. And that's what I want to share with you today, what I shared this past Shabbat. So what Adler says is, first of all, there's a trope of the covenantal blessing that Abraham gives to Isaac and Isaac gives to Jacob, and it's got 4 elements: fertility, relationship with God, connection to the land, and ability to transmit the blessing to others. And what she argues is, when we get to this past week's Parsha, Vayechi, end of the book of Breshit, and Jacob blessing his sons, we tend to read that blessing through the lens of Shemot and the rest of the Torah, which is to say, we know that the 12 tribes are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel, so we assume that Jacob's intention is to bless them all equally. Not equally, some of them get a nicer blessing, some of them get a less nice blessing, but it's our understanding that when he gathers his 12 sons around him at his deathbed, he's blessing the 12 of them to become his successors in the 12 tribes of Israel. But Adler says if you read the text closely, there's actually no reason to think that. Because when he's blessing the sons, only Joseph's blessing has any of the elements of the 4 elements of the covenantal blessing. He's the only one who mentions God's name. None of the other ones get God's name. And so between the deathbed scene and the previous chapter where Jacob blesses Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh, Adler argues, I think persuasively, that it really looks, for all intents and purposes, like Jacob is not intending to include the other sons. He's continuing to follow the trope that we've seen throughout Genesis, where there's a chosen son and an unchosen son. In this case, there's a chosen son, Joseph, and there's 11 other unchosen sons. And, there's nothing wrong with the unchosen sons. He gives them blessings. They're each going to become their own nation, blah, blah. But Joseph, in Adler's read, is the one whom Jacob intends to continue the covenantal relationship with God. And part of the crux of that argument is when Jacob says to Joseph, "Your 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, will be to me like Reuben and Shimon." Note that it doesn't say they're going to be any old sons. They're not going to be like Dan and Naphtali. They're going to be the Bechor, the firstborn, and the secondborn, which is to say, he's marking them out as the continuers through Joseph of the covenantal blessing. So in Jacob's mind, it's going to go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Ephraim, and from there on to Ephraim's firstborn son, or to the secondborn that gets supplanted into the firstborn's position. That supplants, rather, into the firstborn's position. And And so then we get to the very end of Breshit, the end of the Parsha, and there's this very short section that we tend to read just sort of as an epilogue, not very significant. That in fact Adler says we should read as the climax of the whole book and the surprise twist ending. So after Jacob has died and they've buried him in Canaan and all this, Joseph is getting ready to die, and he calls his brothers to him and he says, God will remember you and will take you up out of Egypt back to the land. She says, in that moment, it's the same type scene of the dying patriarch blessing his sons that we've seen with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, but Joseph changes it. And actually, to explain the change, I have to go back a step. What Adler says is that Joseph's unique genius, his spiritual gift, is seeing abundance where other people see scarcity. And you see that most clearly in interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, where Joseph understands the abundance that's going to come and the way to transmit it so everybody has enough. In Adler's read, that's not just smart public policy or smart resource management. It's actually a spiritual intuition into how to manage God's gifts in the world and how to build a society where everybody gets what they need. Again, that's in tension for me with this idea of enslaving the Egyptians and taking all their money, but hold that off to the side for a minute. So his gift is in seeing abundance where other people see scarcity. And so according to Adler's read, Joseph makes a decision not to just pass on his blessing to Ephraim and continue the pattern of a chosen son and an unchosen son. He chooses his brothers instead of his sons. And with that line, Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, God will remember you, he includes his brothers. He expands the blessing, so it's not just his, it belongs to all 11 of his brothers. And in that way he shifts the dynamic, so that going into the book of Shemot, you've got 12 tribes of Israel, and they're all going to share the covenantal blessing together. So it does two things. It in some ways redeems all the brotherly competition throughout the book of Breshit, but more to the point, it sets up who the Israelites are going to be in the coming books, due to Joseph being the one to share the blessing among them. Shavuot Tov, have a good week.